Today we have a very special guest joining us, Frank Mariage. Frank has been a partner at Fasken Law and a member of its global mining group since 2012, where he practices in the areas of securities, corporate, and mining law. Frank has developed particular expertise on legal issues affecting the mining industry and is the former chairman of the board for the Quebec Mining Exploration Association. He's a mainstay on the best lawyers list in Canada's directory for the natural resources sector, and he's a seminar speaker for the TSX Venture Exchange. On this episode, Frank and I chat about mining investment in politically insecure climates, his journey into mining law, and the biggest mining scandal in history, Bre-X. Thanks again for joining us on The Rocks. Let's dive in. So, Frank, thank you so much for joining me on The Rocks tonight. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Thanks for the invitation. Very happy.
Yeah, you're calling from cold Canada,
Yep.
right? I'm down here in warm, still relatively warm Florida.
It's snowing today, actually. So I'm pretty happy about that. The skier in me is looking forward to getting on the slopes.
And you're not technically drinking anything on The Rocks. What are you drinking tonight?
I'm not a hard liquor kind of guy. So I have a nice bottle of red that's accompanying me. It's a Pinot Noir from a private vineyard in Canada, in an area called Prince Edward County, which is just an hour and a half away from Toronto towards Kingston. It's right on Lake Ontario, and I discovered that area 2 years ago with a buddy of mine who's a sommelier who lived in Toronto, and we spent the weekend there. And then we visited a whole bunch of vineyards, and I discovered absolutely fabulous wines. And I bought a bunch of cases, and I brought them back to Montreal. And this was one of them it's called Hubs Creek. It's a Pinot Noir. It's 2016 unfiltered, Prince Edward County. Pretty nice, I have to say.
Awesome. We'll have to make sure to give them a shout out. I went for a themed whiskey tonight. So since I'm talking to a lawyer, I found B&E entering. So Breaking and Entering American Whiskey, which has a Law and Order type theme on the front. And they said that it's actually really good. I'd never heard of it before. But it says, "We take tremendous pride in the legacy of our whiskey with a wicked little side hobby of barrel thieving." So they go out and, of course, they use a bunch of different barrels from some of their favorites and bring it together for a criminally delicious whiskey. So it's actually pretty good.
Good.
I like it. Yeah, from St. George.
Maybe I should try that next time we do get to see each other in person. Maybe I'll try it. See if you give me a luck whiskey.
I know. It won't even be next PDAC, right? Next PDAC. It'll be virtual. Exactly. Yeah, and I was just talking to you about the first time we met was also in sort of a strange place. We met in Algeria.
Indeed, yeah. And I think we all got off the plane and we went to the Geological Bureau, I think, of Algeria, which was about an hour and a half drive from the airport. And I don't know about you, but I hadn't slept. And then they were expecting us to spend the day, listen to people talk, looking at some rocks, and boy, that was tough. And then on the way back, it wasn't.
We all just
before we get
back to the hotel.
Another hour and a half seminar with KPMG, I think, before we even made it back to the.
That's right.
It was interesting, but man, it was tough. Yeah, met
we had and that was. I'm trying to remember how long, a few years ago, but it's such an interesting place. I'm sure.
Yeah, November 2018.
Okay, yeah. So like 2 years ago. Countries like that always remind me of how important a mining law is and the legal infrastructure, because Algeria still, I think, has a rule that any investor can only own up to 49% of a project or company in there, right?
Yeah, it's they call it they have a term in French, but in translation in English, it's the 4951 Act, and it's a significant barrier to foreign investment in Algeria, and they say they've modified it, and you'll remember the conference we attended with KPMG where they were kind of downplaying that rule. But I mean, at the end of the day, facts are facts, and you're still seeing that there's a difficulty with investment in the country. It was an interesting trip. I mean, we did see some interesting stuff. You'll remember, Emily. I mean, I have a sentimental value because to that country because my parents are actually from there. Uh,
Yes, that's
and they went through the War of Independence. My parents left the country in '63 and immigrated to Canada in '65. So I took my father there after 37 or 40 years. He hadn't been back, and then I went back with a couple of once or twice, and then with the trip that we had organized. So got to see this was obviously more investor driven, and you'll remember I think the Ministry
Mhm.
of Mines had organized a panel that day, 1 day panel. I don't know if you were there, but and they asked me to speak on the as an expert in mining law. And there was somebody from Deloitte too, and one of the things that I tend to look, and I've done a few African countries, and studied some mining codes for various clients, and have given some seminars to and for different government officials in a couple of countries, mostly French African. I mean, it's obviously very tough climate in Algeria. Insecurity plays a good part.
Mhm.
Security issues, and you know, they haven't invested a lot in their
Fine.
yeah, they haven't so they say they know what they have, but they don't, right? And I think that any
Mhm.
jurisdiction that really wants to attract foreign investment and it really wants to make sure that they have to know what's in the ground, so they have to invest, government,
Yeah.
public dollars, and they have to invest with the Ministry of Mines and their Geology Bureau, and they have to go out there and do that the first exploration that's required, and to know what they have, make that data available to the public, and that's how you
Mhm.
attract investment. You have to facilitate exploration, not put barriers. And and
Yeah.
and and and, and right? I mean, you've gone in some pretty funky places. You know, there's no exploration, there's no mine. It's the
Right.
beginning.
And I think it's like you said, the many jurisdictions don't really understand that they're competing for investment dollars. So you're competing against an investor putting their money into Canada, Australia, jurisdictions that they perceive to be much, much less risky. So you have to de-risk as much as you can, and doing the exploration or funding the exploration is a great way to de-risk it for that investor, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's totally
Yeah.
tied, right? And that's what really blows
Yeah.
me away is to find all these jurisdictions that go out of their way to make it so hard to keep an exploration permit. And so you look at the mining code
Right.
and you say, Jesus, okay, well, let's move on. Next, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So, what if you were talking to someone who's new to the industry as an investor and they're looking at different countries, and let's assume that they're not a lawyer, but if they're trying to do their own research, what are some things to look for that would tell you if it's a good jurisdiction or a not so good one from a legal perspective?
well, listen, I have tremendous respect for the Fraser Institute survey that's published every
Yeah.
year on the top mining jurisdictions. You know, and I think,
Hmm.
and it's easily available on the internet. You know, and it's published once a year, just before PDAC actually. Uh, and I
Yeah.
think they launched at my firm's office in Toronto actually every year. But so it's available. It's a good start. Look at what's out there, and then after that, you want to do a bit of digging. You find some. I think you need to find some articles on the investment climate as a whole in the jurisdiction.
Mhm.
So you'll easily find some on the net, either from the big accounting firms will have reports, country reports. Law firms will do the same. So you want to do some due diligence on the investment climate, and then you also want to do the deal on the some due diligence on the regulatory framework, and you do the same thing, right? You try to
Mhm.
consult some publications on the mining jurisdiction, the mining code. What is and then by doing that, also you try and find a few examples of companies that have had success, right? If you're going into a
Right.
jurisdiction and you can't find any company that has some reasonable success, that's usually a good indication.
Yeah, not a good place to start as a new
Yeah,
investor, right?
yeah,
Maybe work in the countries that have demonstrated success
yeah.
previously.
If you're looking, and also, we were talking about it before. What's publicly available? What's the government made publicly available? So you go on the Mines
Hmm.
website. Can you get information on the mineral potential of the country? How many mines are there?
Hmm.
Technically, a jurisdiction, a serious mining jurisdiction, will have all that information available.
I think that's also something that the governments don't often understand, that making the data free and publicly available actually attracts investment. Where the countries I work in, I see this tendency to want to charge for data or restrict it to pre-qualified bidders, or they're only going to give it to certain
Yeah.
companies, and that's not really the way the mining industry reacts, right? If the data is free and they can look at it and see anomalies, or see areas that they think are prospective, that's what's going to encourage them to come and take a look at the country. And so much of our industry starts with the juniors, right? I
That's
mean,
another thing I mentioned during that day and that symposium in Algeria. They said, listen, that most of the time, the ones who are going to take the risk are the juniors. It's not going to be the majors, right? And you have to
right.
facilitate. And so juniors are, they don't have a lot of staff, don't have a lot of money. They do have limited, and they spend their dollars very carefully. You have to make things easy for them. And if they're without
Mm-hmm.
juniors, I mean, it's a simple equation. Without juniors, there's no discoveries. Plain and simple.
Right.
Majors will do discoveries, but without juniors, there's no. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, I remember back in the day when I was chairman of the Quebec Mining Exploration Association, and we have these statistics that we look at every year and that we publish. And I'll remember, 2011, I think was a really good time for mining. I think we'll agree. I mean, we got. I mean, the province of Quebec, I think, hit close to $1 billion in mining exploration and development expenses, which was a record high.
Mm.
And obviously, 2012 and 2013, it was just like a steep slope downwards. And then we started to look
Mm.
into, well, okay, how much of that decrease was juniors versus majors? And you know what? I can't say I was surprised. For majors, their exploration budget was a straight line. It's the
Ah,
junior that plummeted. So what does that tell you?
plummeted.
It tells you that when there's exploration and active exploration in a friendly jurisdiction, and it's the juniors that do the exploration.
And that's where I think people new to the industry think of mining and they think of the big names, right? They think
Yes.
of the Bre-X and the Newmonts and the Rio Tintos, and those companies come in much later in a new jurisdiction, right? Or in a new area. I mean, it's all these essentially prospectors
There
that
you
are out,
go.
crazy geologists out there looking for gold
I
that
mean,
then go and raise a little bit of money
yeah,
and do a little bit more
absolutely.
work.
There was a book published in Quebec. It's in French, unfortunately, so I can't share it with you. But it's on Eleanor. Uh,
Mm.
Newmont Gold Corp's mine, right? They purchased it
Yeah.
in 2006, but and it was I'll always remember that because I was fortunate enough to be on the selling end as advisor to the
Mm.
sellers to that deposit. And they started the prospecting work in the beginning of the 90s in
Wow.
helicopters, and it's a great story. But it took them
Yeah.
over 10 years to find a deposit, and then Goldcorp came in, and then everybody talks about that. But to your point, behind that story and those big majors that put in billions of dollars to develop a mine, there are stories like that of these prospectors that just actually go out there, and that's an essential part of our
Look at rock.
industry, right?
Yeah. 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 And that's why it's interesting, and in the markets where you and I have both been, especially North Africa, where you have a lot of oil and gas. I think they don't understand mining because of that. In oil and gas, you kind of have the
Mhm.
opposite. You do have the majors who come in and do the early
Mhm.
exploration, as opposed to, so they're expecting the Exxon equivalent to show up on their
Yeah,
door with a bunch of money to put into the
yeah.
ground. Yeah.
That's a good point.
Well, so speaking of of being the on the selling side of that deal, how did you end up getting into mining?
Oh, yeah. Well, so listen, I mean, obviously, I've been practicing for 20 years now. So I started
Hmm.
off, I was interested, first and foremost, wanted to do securities law, right? And work for, stock exchange companies and do financings and stuff. And then I got hired by a boutique law firm out of Montreal that did that, but that did it exclusively or almost exclusively for the mining industry, mostly, mostly
Mm.
juniors. So that's how I started. And obviously, we started getting into there was the securities aspect, but there was also the business aspect of it, right? The options, the
Yeah.
ventures, the know-how behind it. And I'm a very curious person, and I started asking a lot of questions. I wasn't just satisfied by being asked to do this or do that. I needed to understand, so I started asking questions to CEOs of these various clients to understand the business and the reason why deals were structured this way, or the reason why they were selling their assets, and why they were switching, or they were selling that asset for that had a gold prospect and were going into base metals. Or so that took me a couple of years to understand that know-how. I didn't develop it through university, because I mean, even in those days, you didn't have resource law courses. I understand you have a bit more now, but in those days you didn't. And that's how I got into it. And after 20 years, I consider myself today more. I still do the security side of it, but
Hmm.
I really enjoy putting together a good mining deal and helping my clients structure it. And that's where I get my kicks, honestly.
So how do you find the mining deals to be different from other commercial deals you work on, or the people, or
Well, I
why?
mean, listen,
Go ahead.
we're all going to say our industry is unique because we're passionate about it. And honestly, I work exclusively in mining, so I'm not going to try and compare that to anything else. But uh, people are just so passionate, right? And
Yeah.
especially when you work for juniors, right? And I mean, it's their baby, it's their discovery.
Yeah.
They put all their heart and soul into it. Some of them even their own personal money, right?
Yeah.
And I like that side. I like that startup kind of style. That startup kind of
Yeah.
to it. And you know, listen. I mean, we've all done it. I don't do it as much now because it's a bit more difficult waking up in the morning. But those late nights sitting with a bunch of geologists telling their stories of out in the bush, and it's really interesting, right? And but it's also fun getting a kick out of working with majors as well, right? It's always fun, helping a major that's put its hand on an asset, that's developing it, and that turns it into a premier employer in the region wherever they are. Mines are
Yeah.
always usually a lot in remote areas, so. When you're a faraway town and you help a client put together a mine that employs 400 people, you kind of feel good about
Yeah. Makes a huge impact in that
it.
community when a company of that size comes in.
Especially that they're
Yeah.
extremely well paid jobs, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's in the same way that you wouldn't really have discoveries without the juniors. It would be really hard to build mines without majors, right? I mean, they're expensive.
Yeah, there you go. And I've told these stories a couple of times, but it honestly, not that it shaped my career, but it's always helped me orientate my the way I see mining and the way I want to be a service provider. When I was acting for the seller on the Eleanor deposit, it was a company called Virginia Mines that sold the deposit to Goldcorp. Uh, and anybody in the mining industry will know the Andre Gaumont, who was the CEO of the company. Andre is a friend, has become a friend. At that time, he was a client. Today, he's a friend. I'll
Yeah.
always remember what Andre said at those. And I had been practicing for 4 or 5 years. And he said, Frank, you know what? He goes, I'm a prospector. I'm an explorer. I'm
Hmm.
an explorer. I find the bloody things, and then I sell it to the people who know what they're doing to put it into production. He goes, that's my business model. And I said, yeah, Jesus, you know what? And I've always tried to not determine my practice, but like make sure my practice is always around those guidelines, right? Yeah. Mining explorers have a specific specific needs, and majors
Yeah.
have totally different needs. You have to be able to adapt to that.
Yeah.
You know, you have
Yeah.
to wear a different kind of hat when you're working for a major than when working for an explorer. You have to be able to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and you have to, I'm sure, as the lawyer involved, you have to be able to translate between the two, maybe,
Yeah.
right? And kind of help them see each other's position when you're doing negotiations. I would
Yeah.
imagine.
Yeah,
Very
yeah,
different
and I'll tell you,
personality.
right? Because I mean, I've gone through this just recently, right? You're a junior company, and you want to buy an asset from that. There's a good one. You want to buy an asset from a major.
Mm.
Try getting their attention. Right? So you
Oh
got your
yeah.
client.
Yeah.
For him, it's the deal of the century, and then
Yeah.
next thing you know, he doesn't hear from him for 20 days. Right? It's because it's
Oh,
so
just
low
kill
on
him.
their priority list, or because their in-house lawyers they have procurement contracts to look at, and they have a bunch of things before they even can get to that kind of contract, right? So it's always it's interesting because you got to manage your clients' expectations too, right? I have no problem putting out
Hmm.
putting out the contract, but I mean you have to realize that sometimes it's going to take a while.
It might take a while. Oh, now speaking of clients, I did not prep you to answer this question, so
Uh-oh.
you can plead the fifth, at least in American parlance. So, when people think of lawyers, they also think of people that you pick up the phone and call when you're in trouble,
Yeah.
right? Like, does that ever happen in the mining sector? Like, do you have clients who like call you and say, "Uh-oh, Frank, come bail me out," essentially? Come- like, is that a thing? Or is it really more just contracts, negotiations?
That'll happen. No, it'll happen. It'll happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll happen. It'll happen on yeah, let's use juniors for example. Okay, juniors obviously budget's tight. Um, they want to do a lot of things themselves, and they'll
Mm.
negotiate contracts and write them themselves, and so you see a lot of stuff go by, and you're like, okay, well, I definitely didn't write this. Um, and then obviously they sign and they announce the transaction, and then they get a call from
Hmm.
the stock exchange and they say, well, what's this? You know, yeah,
Oh,
you've
yeah.
triggered this, and we want this, and then they're like, holy, I didn't see this
Yeah.
one coming, and they call me up, and I said, okay, well, explain the transaction, and we get on the phone with the stock exchange, or I've had that unfortunate call at the wee hours of the morning of a client on an exploration project in the far north. It's Frank. We've had somebody died on the project. What do we do? Unfortunate
Yeah.
accident.
Yeah.
Then you call your people and they say, okay, and here's what you got to do, and so you got all that. Unfortunately enough, it's not the norm, right? Once in a while,
Mm. Yeah.
I do get or clients that signed contracts themselves, and drafted, and then they're in a not a shakedown, but they're in a disagreement with their partner, and they're at a stand, they're at a point where it's do or die, and they give you a call, and you look at it and you say, well, why did you sign this, and did you consider this, and you consider that, and I think that's where they say to themselves, Frank, why didn't I call you? Why? Oh, well, that's an
Why did,
excellent
yeah.
question. Why did you call me at the time?
I think my lawyer, I'll give him a shout out, Tom Lujan. I think he was the one who once told me lawyers are like dentists. If you just go to them preemptively, then you never need a root canal, right? Like just have your lawyer review it all ahead of
Yeah,
time. And that way you don't,
yeah,
you know, yeah.
yeah.
No, it's because you've done work all over the world, or you've certainly worked in a lot of global
Mhm.
jurisdictions. So that's what makes me think with all the news we have now around human rights and some of the things
Mhm.
coming out even this year with mining companies being held accountable for working conditions in foreign mines, for
Yeah,
example. Um, it's becoming more complicated because the world is more connected,
exactly. The ESG
right?
component, the diversity component is
Hmm.
becoming, very important factors for institutional investors. And the social
Yeah.
acceptability, all the ESG is maybe 15 years ago it was somewhere in the list. but maybe more down.
Hmm.
It's in the higher part. It's on the short list, right? So yeah, I mean, yeah, it's been
And
sorry, go ahead.
how do you see that? How do you see that reflected in your work? The increased focus on ESG. Is it in the contracts or the what's kind of changed,
Yeah.
or has it? And it's just a bunch of talk.
No, it's not
I mean,
just a
that's what
bunch
some
of
people
talk.
tell us.
It's
Oh,
not
it's
just a
just
bunch of talk.
marketing.
You won't see it in the junior contracts, like for the juniors, the deals, the options, and the JVs. I mean, you won't see that. Maybe you will start, but it's not something I see. But I think you're seeing a lot more the need to, before. I mean, to paint a picture, before you'd have an exploration budget, you start doing some preliminary work, you know, delineate certain zones, bring in a drill, and then start drilling it, and then go see the people. Oh, hi, by the way, I've been here for X number of years. And
Yeah,
today it's the other way around. Even before you even remotely start doing anything like that, you go see the people, right?
yeah,
So that it's been a
yeah,
complete shift, right? So I think, and yes, the majors are putting that in their policies, and if they sign JVs with juniors, they want to make sure that they implement the ESG policies, and investment funds want to make sure that even juniors have ESG policies in place. One of the funds that the fund that I chair, which is a Quebec-based exploration fund called CDEX, we ask any issuer or junior that we invest in that they have a sustainability policy. Sorry, and
yeah.
so I just think that it's coming more and more important for juniors to invest in that
Mm.
from the beginning, because let's not forget, we talked about the importance of exploration and prospectors. They're the first ones on the ground. So
Right. And they said, oh,
anything they don't do, whoever
right,
buys the asset will pay for
right. They
it. Yeah.
inherit any screw up.
Exactly. So it's part of de-risking
Yeah.
your project as well. It has to be part of your core values, of course. I mean, you want to be in collaboration with the
Hmm.
community for sure. Has to be part, but you're also doing it as part of de-risking your project, right? Because if you
Yeah.
don't do that, you risk paying a very high price.
Yeah. And you really set the tone in that local community for anybody else coming, even in other districts or in other projects. If it's in the district, right, you can create a lot of problems for anybody coming in after you if you don't do it the right way. And who wants
No,
that? Then nobody buys you drinks at the bar, So yeah.
it's an essential part. And I mean, and things that you talked about other jurisdictions. I mean, having been in a couple of countries in Africa and sitting down and meetings with government officials, a lot of jurisdictions have huge issues with artisanal mining, right? Artisanal mining and
Right.
illegal mining on projects that are operated by majors. I mean, I'm part of an association called World Association of Mining Lawyers, and we get together once a year, and we talk shop, as they say. And
Yeah.
last year, of course, our last June, our event was canceled because of COVID. The year before, I put on a panel on artisanal mining, and I had people from like Endeavor, for example, and who
Hmm.
gave us and Ashanti,
Mm.
and told us what their day to day is with artisanal miners, and they showed us some pictures.
Mm.
It was like illegal miners standing not even 10 meters from a huge truck, and just and so
Yeah. Just
it's a huge issue, and millions and millions of people depend their everyday lives depend on these illegal mining activities, especially in Africa,
hmm
right? And in Latin
so you can't just go ahead and shut them down, right? Because then you destabilize the whole economy of that local community. And I think a lot of times people say, well, the mining companies should just hire those artisanal miners. But as you pointed out, mining is a well-paying job, but it's increasingly a more technical job, right? It's not
America.
necessarily what people think of as like West Virginia coal miners
Yeah,
with
yeah,
pickaxes. So you can't necessarily just hire every local
yeah.
that wants to work in the
And that's
mine.
why I think you're seeing more and more companies and ideas and projects of of going into a community and putting in, putting a small operation there with a portable mill or whatever, and then signing contracts with all these miners who,
Right.
instead of treating their gold or their ore, with mercury and with huge damage to their personal health and to the environment, that's a huge environmental hazard. You sign these deals with these local artisanal miners who bring you their ore. You treat it, and you pay them a certain percentage for their ore, but you treat it in an environmentally friendly fashion. And it's good for everyone.
Right. And
So you're seeing more and more.
and you legalize, essentially, right? You're legitimizing what they're doing, and you're pulling them into the legal economy. Even in the work I did in Afghanistan and Iraq, that was a big thing, that if you can pull people into the legitimate economy by having some kind of contract or mechanism with a big legitimate company, it has a huge stabilizing factor, right? I mean, it cuts out a lot of middle people, and they then can build up past performance and learn skills doing that they wouldn't learn doing it the old way. Yeah. Well, on to my other question for you. So I know when we were talking about topics for tonight, I wanted you to give me like your top mining scandals in history from a lawyer perspective, Law and Order, the mining edition. But but I know at least they've even made movies about. That's right. The mother of all scandals was Bre-X. And I think, especially for listeners who maybe are new to mining, maybe just what is Bre-X, and what did it do from a regulatory perspective?
Remembering that I was in my early 20s when that happened. I was still in university.
Yeah.
So I don't know the story all that by heart, but obviously what happened is, a company that said had found a significant deposit in Indonesia. And what we later found out is that all the lab essays that were sent to quantify the presence of gold were not counterfeit, were fake, because though the geologist in charge, I think it was Guzman, would I think with his ring would put gold dust in the bag, and that obviously totally faked and increased the potential resource of the property. And people saying, "Oh, this is the biggest deposit in the world," and I don't know, what did their stock go to?
Right.
$400 and something before.
Yeah, and it got up. I mean, their valuation was something like $7 billion US, I think, at the peak. I mean, just massive. Which now, I mean, how it got to that level without on the ground due diligence by anybody else, now that it sounds crazy, right? You would never see that. This was all off of drill cores that just kind of mysteriously came out of the jungle, right? I mean,
so that's, I mean, to me, that's the mother of all scandals. I mean, nothing has compared to come close to that since, and there's probably a reason for that, right? Yeah. Because that paved the way for 43-101 standard disclosure, right? And I know that hurt the industry very much. That hurt the industry a lot. I remember speaking to some colleagues who've been practicing for far longer than I have, and said, "Frank, after Bre-X, forget raising any dollars for mining. I mean, it wasn't possible."
Yeah.
And it happened. And that occurred for a couple of years, and then the .com bubble came, and then that was more difficult. Mining wasn't getting any attention. But then 43-101 came, right? And 43, I think, increased and gave more credibility to the industry, which is a good, and but to me, that's the mother of all scandals. I mean, for the rest, we saw a bunch of stories that have happened. I mean, people today will tell you, a feasibility study is not worth the paper it's written on. All these assumptions and these premises. I mean, can we really rely on that? I think we can, but we've seen stories of companies that have had, and I'm not going to name any, just so you before I have them in mind, but stories of stories of feasibility studies where project is robust, and next thing you know, it's not the case.
Well, I've gotten that question though from investors who say, okay, so if someone's talking to me about a project that's been around for a long time, and you have multiple companies that come in and do a different, slightly
Mm.
different resource estimate, different feasibility study, I think it's part of what makes it complex for people to look at the industry, because there is still
Mm.
interpretation and that individual or company thought around how to develop an asset. It's not just black or white, right?
Hey, Eleanor was first, I think. Was Noranda did some exploration work on there in the 70s, I think. The beginning of the 80s, it put it off.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
so I mean, as techniques evolve, you can't.
Hmm.
To your point, right? Techniques evolve in mining and projects. Thank God, because it allows us to with what the tools we have today is to find these ore bodies, to find these future mines, and who maybe at the time were not either feasible or economic, right?
Or they could have had the wrong team associated with them too, right? I mean, that's something we see a lot. I mean, you might have a team that comes in with the right kind of experience and the right, dynamic at the right time, and it can make a project, just like any other business,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So, I mean,
yeah,
it's something that with our platform
yeah.
prospector, we hear people say the same thing that you mentioned about feasibility studies with 43101s. They'll say, oh, they're always so conservative, right? There's always, yeah, sure, that's what they tell the public, that's the public disclosure information, but there's always a lot more going on. It's like, well, at least for a baseline, though, at least to kind of understand in general what's going on with the project, it's still a huge improvement and a great source of data. And if they're conservative in general, then from an investment perspective, they're a great place to start,
Couldn't
right?
agree
I
more.
mean,
Couldn't
yeah,
agree. Couldn't agree more.
yeah.
And those reports, they're there for a reason, and they're extremely,
Mhm.
they're regulated, and you got some serious people in the industry who abide by these rules, and it's
Mhm.
too easy to just write them off, right?
Right. Yeah. If someone's saying that, you usually have to dig a little deeper. And I always point out to folks that are new that 43101s contain information like ESG factors, right? Companies have to talk about their environmental plans, the social and community support. All of that is in there, and it may be a few years old, right? If they don't have a relatively new 43101, but again, it at least gives you a starting point for where they are.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it is. I mean, obviously, the technical section, not everybody can go through it. I mean, it's
Done.
I mean, you understand it, but me, I mean, I'll understand some parts of it, but it's very, so I'm going to focus on, do they, do they respect the form of the report? I'll read the summary. What are the mining rights? What are the royalties? Any issues? What's the history of the project? And then go to the end. What's the recommendations? And then I'll leave the technical part for people like you, Emily, who can actually read and understand this stuff.
So that's a good point. So that's what you would look at if you were talking again to an investor who's new to the industry. Those are the parts that you would focus on. Maybe get technical advice or expertise on the technical parts of the report, but the things you listed off are really good things for an investor to look at
Yeah. Look at the summary of the
and
report
kind of
and
look.
the titles and what and just the beginning and obviously the technical section if you can understand. But I mean, if you're an average investor, you won't be able to understand that stuff. Really not.
Yeah.
So
Well, switching over to another one of our little segments that we like to do on each episode. So you must have at least one good adventure story to tell us from when you were traveling or out on site of your work in the mining industry.
there's a couple.
I would save this till later in the podcast where you've almost finished your drink. So usually.
Let me think. I'm just thinking about that because
As yeah, it's like Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah. Mm.
Oh, I'm trying to. Well, I mean, there these stories about the little scarier ones where I'm in Madagascar training government officials on mining, and
Yes, let's hear
and
that.
I'm there during the riots and of the citizens of Antananarivo, the capital, that are extremely dissatisfied, and um, they're geez, I'm looking for that term. I have it in French.
Go ahead,
Rioting,
say it in
they're not
French.
rioting. They're protesting. There we go. I'm sorry.
Protesting? Okay.
Yeah, they're protesting, and people died. People got killed. So
Mhm.
you're at a hotel, and it's pretty stressful. I mean, I've had colleagues who have actually been stuck in a hotel during the coup.
Mhm.
I'm not going to complain. I mean, I was still. So
Yeah.
you got stories like that. Stories where I'm in Cameroon, and we're visiting various sites, and I'll always remember this is where I really came firsthand with the Chinese presence and dominance on the African continent. The Caribbean port, which is a
Yeah.
deep sea port in Cameroon, which was being built. This
Mhm.
was 7 years ago, and this was 7 years ago, and we were fortunate enough to have access and visit the site under construction. I swear to God, you had
Mhm.
the impression you were in China. I mean, everything
Yeah.
was in Chinese, Chinese workers, Chinese cook.
Mhm.
We talked about ESG. I mean,
Yeah.
that's inexistent. You'll
Yeah.
remember when we were in Algeria, and between the
Mhm.
airport and the hotel, they were building the second biggest mosque in the world after the Mecca, and it was being built
Yep.
by a Chinese consortium, by Chinese workers. You remember the
Right.
barracks? We'd go by, and it would all be written in
Yeah.
Chinese. This was in Algeria,
And they were
the
just like
mosque.
paddock containers stacked on each
Yeah,
other, right? For them to live in, all
yeah.
contained on the site.
And I
Yep.
guess,
Yeah, and
yeah, I guess.
by the Chinese government, if I remember
Sorry,
correctly, right? Funded by
yeah,
them,
I'm not
It-
sure.
and funded by the
Yeah, I'm
Chinese,
not
I
sure
think.
about that.
Yeah.
And then I guess maybe the last one that I remember, I got a kick out of it. But I was on an investor relation trip for my client who asked me to tag along because in the Dominican Republic, because he was getting
Mm.
ready to do an offering, and he wanted me to come down to meet with his local council over there and make sure we get ready for the offering. And at the same time, he brought some investors. And I'll always remember, we had to go through Pueblo Viejo before we got to the
Mm.
project, and it was being built at the time. And I have to tell you, it's Pueblo Viejo was a massive, massive project, right? And
Mm.
and I just the enormous, like it's just enormous, right? And it was in construction, and I remember being on top of a mountain and looking down and seeing, well, what's going. Oh, that's where they're building the tailings pond, and just the whole planning.
The
I mean,
scale.
until you see it firsthand, I mean,
Hmm.
it's really something you have to see. So, sorry about
And that's
that.
the I no, and I constantly tell people that's the really cool part though about our industry is you go out to these amazing places and you see things going on in the world that I mean it's the scale of what we do as an industry and where we do it just lends a complete sense of adventure to a huge part
Yeah,
of what we do for work,
yeah.
right? I mean, so it's really cool. And the stories people you meet, the stories you end up with, then you end up being that person late at night with the crazy
Yeah.
geologist
Well,
talking
or the other
stories.
one is, you're out in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and you're visiting a mine that's 100% electric,
Yeah.
and all on turbines that are
Mm,
basically 160 kilometers away. You're like,
yeah.
holy cow.
Well, that's cool. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
this long conveyor belt, bringing the ore all the way to the port, right? And it's massive, and the
Yeah.
logistics behind it is just it's crazy. I mean, when you see it, then you say, okay, I get it now.
Yeah.
So
Yep. And I think that's, I guess here in the US, there aren't that many mines like that still around. So I think people don't connect with it. I guess in Canada, you guys are still so much more involved in the sector. Maybe people understand it more, but it's, on the one hand, I always think that's why it's so important that we as an industry do it right, because it is so
yeah.
large and it has such an impact, right? On the other hand, that's why it takes so much money and so much time to put these things together. Um, and sometimes I think the world doesn't really appreciate all of the work and the expense that goes into generating all the metal that goes into our iPhones and our computers and our electric cars, right? That there are these big, massive mines all around the world.
You had asked me about topics for this session, and I thought, well, I love music, right? And I told you, what about music?
Yeah.
So, can we agree that there are two products that have revolutionized a generation? One is the Walkman, and
Okay.
the other one is the iPod. Like, I'm a Walkman generation. I don't know about you, but I'm a Walkman.
No, no, no. I had a portable. I did have a Walkman, but really, I had like the CD
Okay,
player equivalent, right?
you didn't have
Yeah.
the big
So,
yellow one. You could swim with it in your pool and put a cassette in that. I had that.
well, I grew up in Maine, so I didn't have a
Okay,
pool. We had
okay.
snow.
Yeah, but none of these things would have existed without mining. And these are
Yeah,
products that have, and from a music perspective, that totally revolutionized a generation, right? So that's just
yeah.
an example, but I mean,
Well, and I am curious, since you bring this up, you wanted. So, what is your thought around music and mining? What is the connection there?
well, to me, like, uh, like I said, these products that were generational changing products that would never have existed without mining. That's my connection.
Yeah,
Because I love to listen to music, like, as much as I can. I love to listen to music. I love to, and so when I was a teenager, I'd be listening on my Walkman, and then
hmm,
when the iPod came out, would do it, and even the CDs,
yeah.
so I mean, do I have a band that makes me think about mining? I can't say. I can't. For some reason, I was trying to associate, and I came up with associating between mining and the B-52s. But go figure. I don't know.
I was like, all I could think of were like old country and western
Yeah,
songs, like "Coal Miner's
yeah. Well,
Daughter."
you know what? If you go on Spotify or on Google and put in songs about mining, you get all these coal mining songs for sure.
Yeah,
But I mean, just the
it's
importance
like,
of mining in our everyday lives. I mean, the fact that we're talking, on a live feed through our computers, and Wi-Fi, none of that stuff would exist before. Would exist if it was for mining.
no, no, and that's even like chips. Like I always tell people, like silica.
You know.
The silica that goes into chips, and that's pretty much where my like technical knowledge as far as all of that goes. But like, you wouldn't have computer chips if you didn't have
Yeah.
silica and other components. I mean, even the basic building blocks of the technical world that we live in now would not exist. You can't power things without copper. Even the wireless charging stations that you can buy, I mean, they still plug into the
Yeah.
wall, right, with a with a copper
Yeah.
wire. So it's
What's the
true.
saying?
Yeah,
If you
no,
don't
I
mine it, you have to grow it. Something like that. If you don't mine it, you have to
that's right.
grow it.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
I remember a few years back there was some student protests that were going around, and I'll try and translate it from the French, but there was one student had a banner that said, instead of investing in mines, let's invest in education, right? But in the term min in French,
Yeah.
pencil,
Oh,
okay, because crayon min in French, and it's pencil in English, right? So we trying to do a play
so
with
like,
words. I was like, well, where do you think your pencil comes from, man? How do you think
right.
that comes, And
Yeah.
but that's okay.
No, I always joke. I say, well, while you're tweeting your outrage, just think
Yeah,
about where where the machine that you tweet on came from, which is simplistic, but
yeah,
I think it goes to people who are passionate about making that change. We talk a lot about, if you want a low carbon economy, if you want a high tech economy, if you want all of these wonderful things that I don't think anybody thinks are bad. You actually have to get involved in the mining sector and help us build the mines that will give the world the metal you need to make all this great stuff, right? If you want wind and solar power, then you need metal in order to build those things,
Yeah.
right? So on in and help us build it so you can have low carbon futures and
you know what? I mean,
all
if
this
you
great
visit a
stuff.
mine today, a mine that's been recently constructed or that's under construction or that's been operating, even more older mines, but if you look at all the money they've invested to make it environmentally friendly and all the process that they've put in place, it's astonishing. I don't think the general population knows to what extent the mining industry goes out of its way to make sure that its operation are environmentally friendly, right? As much.
Well, and I even heard last week, I was on Mines of Money, the virtual mining conference last week. I heard from a Canadian nickel company that will be producing zero carbon nickel, right? Like we'll be mining nickel with no carbon. There's all kinds of great stuff out there that's going on.
We may in a couple of years have the first 100% fully electric mine in North America, if not maybe in the world. Yeah.
In Canada? Oh, wow.
Yes.
Very cool.
Things like that are happening that are pretty awesome. And those are all ideas that came from the industry, right? All good things.
And I always remind other folks outside the industry that people don't generally get into mining who hate the environment. Like, I mean, really and truly, the geologists, the engineers, you get into mining because you like to be outside and you like to be out in the middle of nowhere and you like to go out and explore. Yeah. So the folks that get into the industry really do care about it, even though there have been mistakes and companies make mistakes and do things wrong. The people in general really are supportive of keeping things clean.
It's like everything. You always wind up paying for the minority bad actors. But at the end of the day, let's not forget that the majority are outstanding people who like the environment and want to make sure that they leave a cleaner environment, or as clean for the future generations. And I think people have a tendency to forget that. Or environmental groups make sure they forget that.
That's true. And they have great slogans, so I'll give them that.
Yeah, they do a good job. I have to say.
Well, on that note, Frank, thanks so much for joining us. I'll cheers you if you've got any. Oh, yeah, we've got like one last sip. Cheers.
Cheers. I limited it to one glass because I got to work tonight.
Me too. Okay. That's why I needed the one glass. It makes it go by faster.
Thanks for the invitation. It was a privilege. Stay safe, and I really can't wait to seeing you in person, Emily. I hope that.
Absolutely. Hope it's sooner rather than later. I miss popping up to Montreal for dinner. I miss my poutine and all the good food up there.
You better let me know next time you're in town.
Absolutely. Thank you to our guest and my good friend Frank Mariage for joining us on this episode of On the Rocks. To learn more about Frank and Fasken, visit fasken.com and check them out on LinkedIn at Fasken. For more about Prospector, go to prospectorportal.com or check us out on Instagram at ProspectorAI and LinkedIn at ProspectorPortal. Thanks for joining us on The Rocks. Until next time, keep your glasses full and your ice cold.